Sorry, Anton's going to have to run and do everything back here today. Yeah, Hebrews chapter 8. You know, one of the things about, we were just talking before the service about studying the Bible and reading the Bible. And, you know, the thing about the Bible is first thing is it's a big book. There's a lot in it, you know, and it's a little bit daunting, you know, if you think about it that way. It's almost like I've gotten the impression sometimes, myself even, and talking to people, it's almost like this huge mountain and you're told to climb it and you don't know where, you know, how to go about it, and it helps to have a few little footholds, or, you know, how to approach it. And I think the most fundamental, important thing to grasp about the Bible, this is just my opinion, is to see, first of all, that it's divided into two parts, and they're labeled for you. For your convenience, they're labeled Old and New. And that tells you something. It doesn't say that the Old is unimportant or that we don't look at it, but we do. It does tell us that the New is more current, or the New is the one that's in force. And the way I look at it is when I read the Old Testament, I read the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament. And this is not just something that I dreamed up, you know, my opinion. I got that notion or that thought from reading specifically in Hebrews chapter 8, which I had you turn to. If you read this whole chapter, Hebrews chapter 8, the whole chapter is discussing that difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And chapter 8 even ends with this very dramatic and sort of surprising to many people verse. See, chapter 8 is quoting from Jeremiah. Right in the midst of the Old Testament, the prophet Jeremiah said, speaking for the Lord, quoting him, "Thus saith the Lord." You know, the prophets in the Old Testament, when they said, "Thus saith the Lord," they're speaking as a mouthpiece for God. They're saying God's words. And the prophet Jeremiah said, "I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Jacob, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. And this is how the new covenant will be." Now this is in the midst of the Old Covenant. God speaking through Jeremiah said, "I will make a new covenant." And this writer to the Hebrews, in quoting that, concludes that the meaning, or the way to understand that, is this. In chapter 8, verse 13, he says, "In that he saith a new covenant," in fact, in other words, the very fact that he's through Jeremiah said, "I will make a new covenant," in that he saith a new covenant, he made the first old. In other words, the reason the Old Covenant is called old is because he said, "I will make a new one." And by the very fact that he said, "I'll make a new one," he made the first old. Now that which it decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. In other words, it's secondary or subservient, or what's the right word for that? Comes behind. It's in terms of importance, the new is more important. And the new gives you insight into everything. Now, some people read the Old Testament. I've heard many people say this. Well, we read the Old Testament and we understand the nature of God. No, I don't think that's true. I don't think you understand the nature of God from the Old Testament. In fact, I think you get a distorted view of God in the Old Testament, distorted by sin. Now, a person might say, well, but there's still sin today. Oh, yes, there is, but sin has been paid for by Jesus, in the mind of God, at least. Sin has been dealt with by Jesus. In fact, so sufficiently did Jesus deal with sin that in chapter 9 of Hebrews, and I don't mean to be skipping around like this, we're told in verse 26 that he put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And Jesus said, and we're going to see this in just a moment, he said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." So the clear vision of God, the clear view of his nature is found looking at Jesus and in the New Testament. Anyway, that's all free, no charge for that. I'm just setting the context here. In fact, this whole book of Hebrews is a discussion of the difference and the superiority of the New Testament to the Old Testament. And everything about it is superior. So, here is what I wanted to read about today. Chapter 8, verse 6. he's comparing the priestly ministry and the temple worship in the Old Testament to the new situation in the New Testament, chapter 8, verse 6. Sorry, Anton. I'll try to say it correctly. Chapter 8, verse 6. Speaking of Jesus, it says, "But now hath he," that is Jesus, "obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much more he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises." And then he goes on to say in the list and mentions some of the reasons that it's better, some of the things that's better about it. And we've talked about this before, and we don't hurt to talk about it again, but what I wanted to focus on today was this expression in verse 6, that Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant. A mediator is a go-between. A mediator is one who mediates between two. A mediator is like an umpire sometimes. A mediator is a person who literally is able to stand between two parties and be able to bring them together. That's the idea of mediation. Sometimes, you know, in everyday life, you might hear the word mediation used in terms of a labor dispute. The employees might have gone out on strike, and they say, "We're not being paid a fair wage." And then the employer says, "Oh yeah, I'm paying you all I can afford to pay you." So they're all mad. The employer's mad, the employees are mad, everybody's mad, they're all striking. And then they bring in mediation. And you sometimes hear this in the news. And then the mediator will get them both to sit down, and he will talk to one and say, "Well, you make a valid point," talk to them, "Well, you have a valid point," and his function is to bring them together and establish peace between them. That's what Jesus does in his role as a mediator. Now, one of the best ways, I think, to appreciate or to understand his role as a mediator to begin with is to examine and to look at a situation before Jesus came, when there was no mediator, when there was no mediation, when there was a perfect God on one side and a flawed humanity on the other side. You could say sinful humanity, or flawed, or any way you want to say it. Anything less than perfect means that there is a disconnect. And so that's why there's need for a mediator. But in the Old Testament, we see that kind of a situation. And one place that it's very clear is in the book of Job. Now, I'm sorry that Phil had to go the way it worked out today, because what got me thinking about this was last week, Job chapter 9, Anton's where I'm going to go. Last week, Phil told me as we were leaving, I don't know what made me think of this. He said, "I've never heard you speak from the book of Job," and I know I have before, but he just didn't remember. Or maybe he wasn't in here. But so that made me think. Well, I remember talking about the book of Job before, but it's an interesting book. It's right after let's see, what is it? Right after Esther, and it's right before the Psalms, I think. Job is considered by many Bible scholars, and they have many reasons for saying this, considered to be perhaps the oldest book, the first one composed, probably predating Moses in the writings of the first books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The reason is because the book of Job, it doesn't refer to any other Bible persons. It doesn't talk about Moses, it doesn't mention Abraham. It's as though, if you're reading the book of Job, it's as though you're reading the ideas and thoughts about God from some very early time when there was not revelation, when there was not the scripture, when there was not a formal revelation through a prophet or someone like Moses. And so there's a lot of ideas about God that are expressed by Job and his friends. And Job, if you read the first chapter of Job, you see this very peculiar situation. And it says that the sons of God, first it talks about Job and his family, and that he was rich and had a big family. Then it talks about, it says that the sons of God, and that expression generally means angels, or perhaps archangels, some superior rank of angels, come and present themselves before the Lord. And one of them, Satan, enters into this discussion about Job. And they are talking about Job, and God says that Job is a man, a perfect man, and that's, of course, relatively speaking. He's in other words, he lives right, he does right, he's a good man. And Satan then challenges that and says, well, it's because